Sweetheart, the briefing starts in 10 minutes, so if you could clear those binders off the main chair and fetch the fresh card from the break room, would appreciate it. And try to find the sugar packets this time. The last girl forgot them. Melanie, music. Fox didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She sat at the far end of the long polished mahogany table, her hands folded loosely in her lap, the air conditioning in the windowless tactical boardroom, humming a low, monotonous drone against the silence that followed the comment. The man who had spoken, a civilian defense contractor named Elias Thorne, didn't wait for a response. He simply turned his back to her, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive charcoal suit, and continued laughing at a joke a lieutenant colonel was telling near the door. Melanie remained still. She was wearing a royal blue blouse that stood out starkly against the dark wood paneling and the sea of olive drab uniforms and grey suits filtering into the room. Her long blonde hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, softening a jawline that was currently set in stone to Thorne and apparently to the 3 other men who had just ignored her presence to stake out their territories around the table. She was part of the furniture to core administrative support sent to take minutes and pour water. She looked down at the table. In front of her sat a single leather-bound notebook and a heavy silver pen. No laptop, no stack of classified briefing packets, just the tools of someone who listened. Another man bustled in, checking his watch. This was Colonel Vance, a man whose reputation for micromanagement had preceded him all the way from the Pentagon to this joint operations base in Germany. He carried the nervous energy of a man who knew he was about to present bad news to a very important person. Vance scanned the room, his eyes glazing over Melanie completely before snapping back to Thorne. Elias, do we have the updated casualty projections for the northern sector? Vance asked, dumping a heavy briefcase onto the table. General Sterling is going to want to know why the logistics routes are still flagged as red. Thorne waved a dismissive hand. We are scrubbing the data now. Honestly, the ground reports are exaggerated. It's mostly local interference, not organized insurgent activity. We'll tell the general that the route is viable for heavy transport. Melanie's fingers tightened slightly on her notebook. She knew that route. She knew the dust that clogged the filters of the MRAPs, the blind corners in the wadi where the shadows grew long and sharp at 400 hours, and the specific frequency of the IED jammers that failed when the ambient temperature rose above 110 degrees. She knew it because she had built the original threat assessment for that sector 3 years ago. Excuse me, Melanie said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a resonance that cut through the low chatter of the room. Thorne turned around, looking genuinely surprised she was still sitting there, his eyebrows raised in a mock expression of patience. Yes, did you need the key to the supply closet? It's usually with the sergeant major outside. The route through the wadi isn't viable for heavy transport, Melanie said, her eyes locking onto his. The ground reports aren't exaggerated. The shale instability on the eastern ridge means any vibration from a heavy convoy will trigger a slide. It's not just insurgents, it's geology. You send trucks through there, you lose them. The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Vance looked at her, then at Thorne, then back at her. He squinted, trying to place her face, but the royal blue blouse and the blonde hair seemed to short-circuit his military recognition software. He saw a civilian woman. He saw a nuisance. Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. He walked over to the table, placing both hands on the mahogany and leaning in, invading her personal space. Listen, miss. I didn't catch your name. Fox, she said. Right, Miss Fox. Look, I appreciate that you might have overheard some things or maybe you read a blog post about the region, but the men in this room have spent the last 6 months analyzing satellite topography and signals intelligence. We aren't talking about a hiking trip. We are talking about complex military logistics. So, why don't you let the experts handle the strategy and you handle the hydration? He gestured pointedly toward the empty water pitcher at the center of the table. Melanie looked at the pitcher. Then she looked back at Thorne. She didn't move. I'm just telling you, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. If you route the supply chain through Sector 4, you are going to get people killed. Vance stepped in, sensing a delay in his meeting prep. Okay, that's enough. I don't know who let you in here early, but this briefing is classified Secret 104. Unless you have a clearance badge that I'm not seeing, I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside until the administrative portion of the meeting begins. We can't have unauthorized personnel auditing strategy sessions. Melanie reached for her purse on the floor and for a second, Vance looked relieved, thinking she was leaving. Instead, she pulled out a lanyard. She placed it on the table. It was face down. "I have a clearance, Colonel, and I was invited to this meeting." Vance scoffed, reaching out to flip the badge over, but the heavy oak doors at the end of the room slammed open. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was a physical shift, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. The casual chatter died, posture straightened. Thorne buttoned his jacket. Vance snatched his briefcase off the table and stood at attention. General Marcus Sterling walked in. He was a large man, not in weight, but in presence. He wore his Army service uniform with a rack of ribbons that looked like a history book of the last 30 years of American warfare. He had the kind of face that had stopped smiling around 2004, etched with deep lines of exhaustion and command. He didn't walk. He marched, consuming the space around him. Following him were two aides, a major and a captain, both looking harried and carrying armloads of maps and tablets. Sterling didn't look at anyone. He went straight to the head of the table, threw his cover onto the credenza, and glared at the empty whiteboard. "We are behind schedule," Sterling barked, his voice gravel and iron. "I want the Northern Sector assessment, and I want it now. And where is the specialist from the State Department? I was told we had an unconventional warfare advisor coming in from D.C. to verify the tribal engagements." Vance cleared his throat, stepping forward nervously. "Sir, we haven't seen any advisor. We were just clearing the room of support staff so we could begin." Sterling turned his gaze on Vance. His eyes were like lasers burning through the colonel's inadequacy. "I don't have time for support staff, Colonel. I have a brigade mobilizing in 48 hours. If the advisor isn't here, we proceed with the intel we have. Thorne, you're the contractor on the geosurvey. Is the route clear?" Thorne puffed out his chest, shooting a smug, vindicated glance at Melanie, who was still seated at the far end of the table, silent and motionless. "Yes," General Thorne said, projecting confidence. "We've scrubbed the satellite data. The Wadi is stable. We recommend the heavy transport convoy proceed through Sector 4. It cuts travel time by 6 hours and avoids the urban centers." Sterling nodded slowly, though he didn't look convinced. He looked tired. He rubbed his temples, pacing the length of the room. "Sector 4, Sterling muttered. "That's the devil's throat. I lost a platoon there in 1909. You're telling me the shale holds?" "Rockwood, General." Thorne lied, or rather guessed with the confidence of a man who wouldn't be driving the truck. Sterling stopped pacing. He stood directly across from Melanie, though he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the map spread out on the table in front of her. He patted his pockets, frowning. He patted his chest. He looked around the table, agitated. "I need a pen," Sterling snapped. "Who has a pen?" The room scrambled. Vance patted his pockets but came up empty. Thorne fumbled inside his jacket. The aides were digging through their bags. Melanie didn't scramble. She didn't rush. With a fluid practice motion, she picked up the heavy silver pen sitting on her notebook. She reached out and held it toward the general. "Sir," she said. Sterling, frustrated by the delay, reached out blindly to take it. "I need to sign off on this order if we're going with Sector 4, he grumbled, his fingers closing around the barrel of the pen. But he didn't pull it away. His hand stopped. For a second, nobody understood what was happening. Thorne was smiling, waiting for the signature that would validate his contract. Vance was sweating, but General Sterling was frozen. His eyes fixed not on the pen, but on the hand holding it. Melanie's hand was steady. Her skin was pale against the royal blue of her cuff. But on her ring finger, resting heavily against the knuckle, was a ring that didn't belong in a boardroom. It wasn't a diamond. It wasn't a wedding band. It was a thick, dull gold band, large and heavy. The crest was worn down, the detailing smoothed by years of friction, contact, and wear. It was a United States Military Academy class ring. But it wasn't just any class ring. Sterling's eyes widened. He looked closer. He saw the deep jagged scar running from the base of Melanie's thumb, disappearing under the cuff of her blouse. A scar that looked like melted wax, the distinctive mark of a burn from a superheated vehicle hull. He looked at the ring again. He recognized the year, 2002. The war class, but more than the year he recognized the hand. The silence in the room stretched, becoming agonizing. Thorne, sensing something was wrong, but unable to read the room, decided to speak. "General, if she's bothering you, I can have her removed." Like I said, she's just quiet. Sterling whispered. The command was so soft yet so violent that Thorne's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Sterling didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the ring. He slowly released the pen, but he didn't pull his hand back. Instead, he reached out and gently, almost reverently, touched the scar on her hand. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to vibrate. A flash of memory hit Sterling, a memory he hadn't touched in 10 years. The smell of burning diesel and copper. The screaming of the radio. A Humvee overturned in a ditch, engulfed in flames. A young lieutenant, a woman, dragging a 200-pound sergeant out of the wreckage while mortar rounds churned the earth into mud around them. He remembered seeing her hand slam against the burning metal of the door frame, prying it open, the flesh searing, but her grip never failing. He remembered the call sign over the net. Fox 2 Actual the Ghost. Sterling slowly raised his eyes. He looked at the woman in the royal blue top. He looked past the blonde hair and the civilian makeup. He saw the eyes. They were grey, steel grey, and they hadn't changed. They were the same eyes that had looked at him through a layer of soot and blood in a medevac chopper over the Pet River Valley. Melanie, Sterling breathed. Melanie nodded once, a micro-movement. Hello, Marcus. The use of the general's first name hit the room like a grenade. Colonel Vance looked like he was having a cardiac event. Thorne's jaw went slack. Sterling straightened up, but he didn't step back. A massive grin broke across his stony face, transforming him from a statue of war into a human being. My God, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When they told me the State Department was sending an expert on asymmetrical warfare and terrain analysis, they said, Dr. Fox, I didn't put it together. I thought you were retired. Melanie finished for him, a small wry smile touching her lips. I am. That's why I'm wearing blue, General. It brings out my eyes better than the ACU pattern did. Sterling let out a bark of laughter, a genuine joyful sound. He turned to the room, his demeanor shifting instantly from confusion to radiant pride. Vance Thorne, he said, his voice booming. Do you know who this is? Thorne stammered. She said. Her name was Fox. She was sitting in the admin chair. Sterling's face darkened instantly. The joy vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory anger as he looked at the contractor. The admin chair. Sterling repeated, dangerous and low. He turned back to Melanie, gesturing to the chair at the head of the table. His chair. Dr. Fox, if you would. Melanie stood up. She picked up her notebook. She picked up the pen. She walked past Thorne, who was now shrinking into his suit, and took the seat at the head of the table. She placed the pen down with a deliberate click. Thank you, General, she said. Sterling took the seat to her right, deferring the lead to her. He folded his hands and looked at the men. For those of you who judge competence by the cut of a suit, let me educate you, Sterling said, his voice ringing off the wood paneling. This is Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Fox, retired former battalion commander, 10th Mountain Division, Distinguished Service Cross recipient, 2 Purple Hearts. She ran the route clearance operations in the exact sector we are discussing for 18 months. She knows every rock, every cave, and every tribal elder in the valley by their first name. She didn't just read the reports, gentlemen. She wrote the doctrine you are currently failing to apply. Thorne turned a pale shade of grey. He looked at Melanie, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the way she sat, not passive, but coiled. He saw the ring. Melanie didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply opened her notebook. General, she said, her voice businesslike and crisp. About Sector 4. I'm listening, Melanie. Sterling said, leaning in. Mr. Thorne is correct that the satellite data shows the road is intact. She began glancing at the contractor. But satellites don't show subterranean geology. The shale shelf on the eastern ridge was destabilized during the earthquake in 2018. My doctoral thesis was on the geological impact of kinetic warfare in this region. If you send a convoy of strikers or heavy haulers through that pass, the vibration resonance will trigger a slide within the first 3 mi. You will bury the convoy. She tapped the map. Furthermore, she continued, looking at Vance. You mentioned local interference. It's not interference. The village at the trailhead is controlled by the Zadran tribe. They aren't insurgents, but they are fiercely territorial. If you go through without paying the toll, which is a meeting with the elder, not money, they will blow the bridge at the exit. You'll be trapped in the kill zone. Vance swallowed hard. We didn't have that intel. You would have, Melanie said calmly. If you had asked me, or if you had read the briefing packet I sent over 3 days ago, the one I assume is currently sitting at the bottom of your inbox because it came from a civilian consultant. Vance looked down at his shoes. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. God damn it. We almost walked into a meat grinder. He looked at Thorne. You said the route was rock solid. You were willing to bet my soldiers' lives on a satellite photo because you were too arrogant to listen to the woman sitting right in front of you. Thorne tried to rally. General, with all due respect, her data is anecdotal. She's been out of the uniform for years. Things change on the ground. Sterling stood up again. He walked over to Thorne. He leaned down, his face inches from the contractors. Things change, Sterling hissed. But geology doesn't, and neither does incompetence. He stood up straight and pointed to the door. Get out, Thorne blinked. General, I said, get out. Your contract is under review, effective immediately. I don't want your advice. I don't want your maps. And I certainly don't want you drinking my coffee. Get out. Thorne gathered his papers with trembling hands. He looked at Melanie, perhaps hoping for mercy. She simply watched him, her expression neutral. He hurried out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Sterling turned to Vance. Colonel, sit down and take notes. You are about to get a master class in mountain warfare. Do not interrupt her. Yes, General. Vance squeaked, pulling out a pen and hovering over his notepad. Melanie cleared her throat. She looked around the table. The dismissal was gone. The condescension was gone. In its place was fear, respect, and undivided attention. All right, she said, pulling the map closer. Let's talk about the alternate route through the southern pass. It's longer. It's uglier, but the ground will hold the weight. For the next 2 hours, Melanie Fox owned the room. She didn't just brief them. She dismantled their plan and rebuilt it from the ground up. She cited load limits, bridge stress points, and tribal politics. She corrected their pronunciation of local dialects. She remembered the names of streams that weren't on the map. Sterling watched her the whole time, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He saw the younger officers looking at her with awe. He saw the way she commanded the space without raising her voice. When the briefing finally wrapped up, Vance looked exhausted but enlightened. Thank you, Dr. Fox, Vance said, and this time he meant it. That changes everything regarding the deployment timeline. Get it done, Colonel Sterling ordered. The room cleared out slowly. Officers filed past Melanie, nodding respectfully, murmuring, thanks. Vance stopped briefly. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. The coffee comment, it was inexcusable. Melanie looked at him. She didn't let him off the hook easy, but she didn't crush him either. Colonel, she said, I don't mind getting coffee. I make excellent coffee, but never assume that the person serving it to you doesn't know more about your job than you do. Standards of respect are just like standards of maintenance. If you let them slip in the rear, they'll fail you at the front. I understand. It won't happen again. Vance saluted a sharp, crisp salute to a civilian and exited. The room was finally empty, save for Melanie and General Sterling. The hum of the air conditioning seemed loud now. Sterling sighed, slumping slightly in his chair, the weight of command settling back onto his shoulders. He looked at Melanie. You haven't aged a day, Mel. Melanie laughed, touching the fine lines around her eyes. You need glasses, Marcus. I've aged plenty. That's why I took the desk job. Sterling pointed to her hand. The ring. I haven't seen that ring since the medevac. I thought you lost it in the crash.